Howdy, boys and girls. Welcome back to Mr. Herring's fifth grade social studies class. Today, we are going to wrap up Unit 5A with the final lesson, the War of 1812. We'll begin with causes, and then tomorrow we'll do effects, and then that will be it. So let's go ahead and get started. The War of 1812, the causes. Our objective today is I can describe the causes and effects of the War of 1812, such as impressment of sailors, territorial conflicts with Great Britain, and the increase in U.S. manufacturing. Our essential question is, how did the War of 1812 unite us? And when I say unite us, I mean the United States. After the War of 1812, or during the War of 1812, it is said that the United States had never been more united before, even during the Revolution. All right, so let's get started. So have you ever been in the middle of two friends fighting, and did you just stay out of it, or did you get pulled in? Well, this is kind of what's going on with the United States. Like we've said before, France and Great Britain have been fighting for centuries, and in 1812 is no different. And the French helped the United States in the American Revolution, and so they were a little offended when we refused to help them or join their war, declare war against Great Britain when they were fighting with Great Britain, and so they kind of got a little upset about it. And so it made things really complicated in the early 1800s. So the causes of the War of 1812, there are several. First, the U.S. ships are being harassed and bullied by the British. So every time a U.S. ship tries to sail across the Atlantic Ocean to go to Europe, or even sail south around the Horn of Florida, British ships are harassing them. Their cargo, their supplies were being taken. Impressment of U.S. sailors is being used by the British, where they take United States soldiers by force to use in their own navy. British soldiers would come on board and just take these men right off the boat and put them on their boat, and they'd be forced to serve in their navy or face consequences, extreme consequences sometimes, as execution. Between 1802 and 1812, the British impressed somewhere around the number of 6,000 sailors. That was just on the American side. Cause number two, British and French interference with U.S. ships. Both the British and the French were interfering with U.S. ships. The French would sometimes take the cargo from Americans. They wouldn't use impressment necessarily, but they would take cargo from the U.S. ships or harass them, make them turn around and go back. Since Great Britain was at war with France, they set up a partial blockade of U.S. ships, so they could not supply the French. The U.S. had worked with the French. They refused to get into the war, but they did supply the French with some supplies that they needed, and the Great Britain did not want the United States to continue that practice, so they put up a blockade where the U.S. ships could not get across and supply the French. Both the British and the French interfered with U.S. ships so that they could not trade with others. This was a big problem. The United States depended on their international trade, and both countries, Great Britain and the French, were not allowing this to happen. So, unfortunately, the United States' main reason to go to war was to gain freedom at sea. That was the number one driving force. The United States wanted to have their freedom at sea and be able to sail across the Atlantic Ocean and trade to continue their economy and build their profits. And this wasn't happening. So the number one reason, the number one cause, was to gain freedom at sea. A third cause, the Americans thought that British were pushing Native Americans to rebel against U.S. settlers. It had been discovered that the British were making alliances with certain Native American groups. And the straw that broke the camel's back was Great Britain created or made this alliance with Tecumseh in the Northwest Territory and supplied the Shawnee Native Americans with guns. Now, this was a big problem. The Native Americans had rifles and things like that from wars past, but now Great Britain is absolutely supplying them with ammunition and firearms, and they're causing a ruckus and getting the Native Americans fired up and motivating them, agitating them to turn them against the Americans, which there had been a little bit of peace between the colonists or Americans and the Native Americans. And now the British alliance with Tecumseh really threatens that. Tecumseh is a huge voice of many tribes in the Native American people, and he has a big say in what they do. So this is a huge problem for for the Americans. And of course, cause number 4, Western and Southern members of the House of Representatives, the Warhawks, we call them, the Warhawks, wanted to force the British out of Canada. Leaders such as Henry Clay insisted we go to war to get the British out of Canada. They were very angry about British kept attacking our ships and turning the Native Americans against us. And so those who wanted to go to war with Great Britain were called the Warhawks. And there were several more, but the main instigator was Henry Clay. He was very adamant. He not only wanted to get Great Britain out of any part of the United States, he wanted them completely off the continent of North America. Cause 5, I think is underrated. We wanted to prove ourselves. It wasn't that long ago. We fought the greatest empire that the world has ever known in Great Britain, and we won. We earned our freedom, we gained our independence, and as a new nation, we weren't taken seriously after that. People still did not respect the United States the way the leaders of the United States felt they deserved. And so a lot of members of Congress and even a lot of the citizens of the United States felt it was time for us to prove ourselves once again and show the world just who we were. We needed to show them that the United States was not to be messed with, not someone to take lightly. So the war begins. The main events of the War of 1812. The war starts. America's reaction, James Madison did not want to take sides. He made it very clear he wanted to remain neutral. But due to these events, Congress passed the Embargo Act, which are trade restrictions between America and Great Britain. So we began to restrict ourselves from trading with Great Britain. Now this hurt both. It not only hurt American merchants, but it also hurt Great Britain. This closed American ports to British ships. They could no longer come into American ports to trade, and American ships were no longer allowed to sail to British ports. This embargo became a major issue as it proved to be a disaster on the American economy. Great Britain was probably our #1 trade partner, and now our merchants are suffering greatly because they are no longer allowed to trade with Great Britain. This causes a lot of problems. So those who supported the war, anti-British feelings started to grow, especially in the South and the West, especially in the South. What's going on in the South is we're producing cotton and we can't trade with cotton with Great Britain, which is detrimental to the South. The Warhawks demanded war with Britain. The main reason they wanted to go to war was to gain freedom at sea. That's it. That's the driving factor here. We want to be able to sail across the Atlantic Ocean and trade with the European countries. There were some that opposed the war, of course. Many New Englanders relied on trade with Great Britain and worried about worsening relations with them by going to war. They were afraid that if we go to war with Great Britain again, it's going to damage those trade relationships forever, and that would be a huge hit to our economy. And of course, merchants and the businessmen were the ones who opposed war because they rely on that trade. If we go to war with Great Britain, they can't trade with Great Britain. They're not going to make money, which is a huge problem. The war begins. The United States military was pretty weak when the war began. We only had 16 ships. Our army had fewer than 7,000 poorly trained men. We had very little equipment, very little firearms, very little ammunition. And the biggest problem was the majority of our officers were extremely inexperienced. Those who fought the American Revolution are no longer with us, or they're too old to fight. They are good for advice maybe and consultation, but to put them in the war to fight is just unreasonable. Here's a little diagram of the war itself. The battles concentrated around the Great Lakes. Most of our fights happened around the Great Lakes because Great Britain was coming from Canada into our country. These little dots over here along the east coast is the British blockade. They did not allow us to leave or come in. You see these blue dots around the Great Lakes are American victories, of course, and of course the blue forts here. The blue squares are the forts. Fort McHenry is, of course, the largest one. A lot of fights, a lot of battles happened in Louisiana and around the Mississippi River, again, because that's where the British came in. There were not a lot of battles on the East Coast. Most of it was in the interior. The War of 1812 itself was best known for its dramatic sea battles, or dramatic battles at sea. The USS Constitution, we called it Old Ironsides. It was an 18-pound British cannonball firing machine. Would bounce right off of Old Ironsides. It was a wooden boat that had been transformed into a metal boat. They took metal siding and covered the entire boat with metal. This was the first of its kind, and British cannons could not damage it. Literally, the cannonball, the 18-pound British cannonball, would just bounce right off. Oliver Hazard Perry defeated the British on Lake Erie, which was the biggest victory prior to the end of the war. This gave the United States control of Lake Erie, which gave us control of St. Lawrence River, which led to the Atlantic Ocean. Perry had a famous speech. He says, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," meaning he have defeated the Great Britain armies in Lake Erie, which was a huge success. Britain blockades the eastern seaboard, which causes a huge problem. This prevented shipping from leaving and made the war more unpopular in the Northeast. The more people in the Northeast get more and more frustrated about the British blockade. They can't get their ships out, and this causes huge problems for Great Britain. We do have some battles on land. Of course, in August of 1814, British forces invade Washington, D.C., and they set sail, or they actually capture Washington, D.C. They sailed in Chesapeake Bay, and they invade and capture Washington, D.C. The British troops marched right into the city with very little resistance. President James Madison at the time had been off fighting another battle. He led another invasion somewhere else down south. They set fire to the White House. Dolly Madison is the first lady. She gathered important papers, and a portion of George Washington then fled south. While the building is burning, while the White House is on fire, she refuses to leave without getting important papers. And one of the biggest treasures she preserves is the very first picture of the very first president, George Washington. They had to break the frame to get the picture out and leave the building. She refused to leave without it. British troops burned the executive mansion and the Capitol to the ground, and the British then began to move and attack Fort McHenry south in Baltimore. The city was completely unprepared for the invaders, but one woman took immediate action. Even as people were fleeing the city in droves, First Lady Dolly Madison refused to leave without some of the nation's most important treasures, including the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. And here's a great picture of what the White House may have looked like when it was on fire, which is extremely devastating. So the Battle of Fort McHenry, probably the most well-known battle. The commander of Fort McHenry requested a very large flag, so the British will have no difficulty seeing it. It was a huge flag, some say probably 30 feet in length. And America's flag flew very high over Fort McHenry. And the British, of course, saw this as an insult and gave them more inspiration to attack Fort McHenry. The Battle of Fort McHenry itself, Francis Scott Key writes the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, while detained on a British ship. So what happened was the British had taken many prisoners, and Francis Scott Key was taken prisoner and put on a British warship off the coast of Fort McHenry. And all night long, he is able to watch the battle that continues all night. And the next morning, as he wakes up, he looks out his window of his cell in the boat, and he sees the Star-Spangled Banner still flying. And this inspired him with great pride to write what became our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814, Ghent, Belgium. The treaty is signed on December 24th, 1814. It officially ended the War of 1812. The war ended in a tie where no party gained or lost any territory. The only loss was life, which was worse. The issue of impressment was not addressed, but it faded on its own. It finally started to fade away. Great Britain finally stopped using it. which kind of settled the war and brought some peace between Great Britain and the United States. Here's a picture of the Treaty of Ghent being signed by both the British and the Americans, which officially ends the war. Now, however, this treaty is signed in December of 1814. But, as you know, it takes a long time for word to get out that the war is over. A young man named Andrew Jackson is a captain in the U.S. Army, and he has happened to know that the British are planning to attack New Orleans. Now, he's heard word that the Treaty of Ghent has been signed and that the war is over, but he refuses to allow Great Britain to come into our country and cause more damage or more loss of lives. So the Battle of New Orleans occurs. It happened after the treaty was signed, but it wasn't ratified yet. The Battle of New Orleans was the last battle or war of 1812. The British had prepared to attack the port of New Orleans, the city of New Orleans, and cut off the Americans' trade on the Mississippi River. But Andrew Jackson caught wind of this and took his own militia, his own army, to New Orleans and was waiting for them before they got there. Jackson's American soldiers defeated the British. It was a bloodbath. It was not even close. Andrew Jackson ran through the British like a hot knife through butter. And this link right here, the Battle of New Orleans, it's a little song about the battle. It's in the Schoology folder. I encourage you to watch that. It's a great little song about the battle itself, little country twang. You'll probably enjoy that. But the Battle of New Orleans is a huge success for the Americans. Andrew Jackson becomes world-renowned, famous for that battle, becomes a very, very popular man. The effects of Battle of New Orleans, final, most deadly battle for the British. Andrew Jackson, of course, becomes a hero. The battle took place 2 weeks after the peace treaty was signed, and there is rumor that Andrew Jackson knew the treaty was signed but didn't care. He went ahead and fought the British anyway, continued the war, but it was in his best interest, and of course the best interest of the United States. And then finally, the War of 1812 is remembered for its dramatic sea battles. The number one cause was the United States wanted to gain their freedom at sea, and it's most appropriate that the war itself is remembered for its dramatic sea battles. The best known naval battles of the War of 1812 were these single ship duels between the U.S. Navy ships and the Royal Navy ships, and this picture here shows you they go head to head against each other until one finally sinks. And there were lots of sinking ships that sit off the coast of the eastern side of the United States and in the Gulf of Mexico as well. All right, so there you go. Hopefully you were able to fill in your notes. If you have any questions, please come see me. Feel free to come ask. Also feel free to watch the video again, and please be sure to check out that little Battle of New Orleans song in the Schoology page. And we'll see you guys next time. Bye guys.